Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Well, hello, and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who had initially accepted the idea, the invitation of going out on a date with somebody that she liked. And then not too long after that, she declined. She changed her mind about going. But it seems like she never said to the guy why she did not want to go. And I kind of delved into this a little bit and started to ask questions myself, because I said, well, it really sounds like the guy doesn't know why you declined his invitation. I mean, did he ask? Did he have a chance to ask? What was the deal here? So initially it was something about that she'd heard that he had asked somebody else out. I said, okay. And then another somebody else said, well, I mean, how is that a bad thing? I mean, the guy is single, right? And she says, well, yeah. And I thought to myself, if he's single, he's not in a committed relationship, isn't it okay if he's asking people out? I mean, clearly that's the case here. I mean, there's nothing behind the curtain. That's exactly what it was. And because when I really tried to pull this thing apart, I tried to ask, well, what made it that you didn't want to go out? And it was because she had heard that he had asked somebody else out. Well, it turns out it was somebody that she had spoken to, meaning a girlfriend. I mean, not really close friends, but, people talk and they just have conversations. They find out, oh, well, I know so-and-so. Yeah, you know so-and-so. Yeah, I know so-and-so. And while it may be a bit uncomfortable, I think, to hear that somebody that you may have had a passing interest in has asked somebody else that it certainly doesn't rise to the occasion of infidelity or cheating or anything like that. And I'm kind of putting that out there because I know my audience of women can probably relate to this, at least emotionally in some capacity. That if you have wanted to go out with somebody, but yet remember now, going out is not some commitment forever and ever. You go out to see if you really want to be in some sort of relationship with the person. And after there's a discussion about commitment and so on, then you have a roadmap. You have an outline for how this is going to go. But in this particular situation, that didn't happen. Now, I'm kind of jumping ahead here because I asked a lot of questions, the result of which really fed my interest in how far we go or how far we don't go, or that we don't invest in asking the kinds of questions that would clear up misperceptions or misunderstandings. And in this particular case, what I'm specifically speaking to is when she decided not to go out after she had already decided she wanted to go, but she decided not to go out. And believe me, you can always change your mind. That's not the problem. The problem is when she decided not to go, she didn't decide not to go because she didn't like the guy. She decided not to go because she heard that he had asked somebody else out, but not in the same time frame, mind you. Now, I'm saying that to you, my listeners, so that you understand that there really isn't any overlap here. There is just a series of conversations that this particular guy had, who is single, who is just going out thinking like it's just friends. And I happen to know some guys who are very gregarious. And it's not about scoring with women. It is about more the idea that, I guess he gets along with them. And again, if, being single, and that's clear that there's, like I said, there's nothing behind the curtain here on that. Being single, you're free to ask anyone. And in this particular case, again, go back to this particular woman who I'm speaking about, I asked her why she decided not to go. And she said she just felt uncomfortable. I said, uncomfortable about what? The fact that he had asked somebody else previous to asking you? And when I say previous, remember, there was no overlap. So the other conversations were something that were in the past. She just happened to find out about it. And so I asked, did you ask him if he had gone out with other people and he not tell the truth about it or something? Have you found anything about this guy that was inconsistent? And she actually said, well, no. And I thought, well, why did you withdraw from going out with somebody who you think, from all indications, it seemed like he was a pretty decent guy. And why didn't you have a conversation with him about it? Because at that point, he didn't know why she changed her mind. He was polite. He accepted that and figured at some point in time they reconnect and maybe the question will get answered. My probing and asking the questions that I asked unearthed a few things, and I think women can relate to this. And I want to speak to the women who have a large mistrust of men because of their experience. We are a product of our experience. And when we've had somebody betray us, obviously it shakes our confidence and we don't know who to trust. And it takes a lot to get ourselves back out there. I know it as a guy. I've dated and I've had dates that were with people who were just really crazy. And I was like, wow, I'm doing a terrible job of picking them, or they're doing a good job of hiding their ugly side until you get to a place where they feel really comfortable about being their whole self. I'm trying to think of a way to explain that. And you see this Jekyll and Hyde thing that happens and says, oh my goodness, I didn't know that happened. And then you're left to deal with it. Well, that's after you've been in a relationship a while. And you've heard this, Joe. You date somebody for 6 months and by then their ugly side tends to show up because it's kind of hard to keep the facade going beyond that. But anyway, that's for another show. But given the experience that we have, and if it's not been a very good one, then it's hard to trust. And I know women who have had relationships that ended terribly, and it makes them a little gun shy about wanting to go out and date again. So that having been the case, when something like this shows up, it obviously brings back all of those old ghosts, and it makes it really difficult to even engage in a conversation. And especially if you're someone who's not necessarily good at that part, having conflict and then resolving it. Because what I find with a lot of people is they're afraid of conflict when it comes to, say, difficult conversations, so they don't engage at all. So what do you think fills the void? It's all of those demons and it's all of that stuff that's already in your head, and you don't work to clear it out. So it really takes practice working on these kinds of things to get good at it. And you don't get good at it overnight. It takes practice. If you have a new person in your life, you're going to have a couple of upsets and figure out how this person is when it comes to conflict. Because one of the things that I have said is that when you are looking for a partner to do things with, I'm talking, something a little more serious, not just friends, but just something a little more serious. You want to know how they are, what their temperament is like. It's one thing to deal with them when everything is going well. But when you have to deal with conflict, that's when you're really going to find a test of who this person is and their character, how they resolve things. Do they dump everything on you to fix it? Do you get all the blame? Or do they like to be part of the solution? And do they Do they make the waters really rough and turbulent, or do they help calm things out? See, those are some of the things that you want to know. And when you have that under your belt, then you have an idea of some things that you can use going forward. Look, I'm going to take a break here, and I'll come right back. I'm going to talk about this some more.
The GSMC Sex Podcast is a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet. Download the GSMC Sex Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you can find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
And we're back. So, as I was sharing, that when you want to develop something with someone, it's great. Things start out fine. Everybody's having a good time. But you want to know how people handle conflict. And it's in that conflict, are they the kind of people that like to calm things out, have a conversation, discuss the differences, find the common ground, we move forward, glad there's a hug, we're not holding grudges, and we can just keep going and having a good time? Or do you have the kinds of individuals that behave in a passive-aggressive way? See, the passive-aggressive ones are the people that you find, they hold on to a grudge. They can be pretty scary individuals to deal with. I mean, I've definitely seen that happen, and that makes you not want to trust either. So you've already got trust issues, and then you bring in this person who is a bit passive-aggressive. All your old ghosts are going to come rushing back forward. But back to the example of my friend who hadn't really talked about what the difficulty was. So in tearing this thing apart, the guy had never told her a lie. Not once. He only expressed an interest in her, and like I said, there was no overlap in the conversations with the other people. She just happens to have found out who they were. Those are the simple facts. Now, these things can get conflated into something else. And if you've had someone who has betrayed you, your mind is going to go right to that stuff. So what do? Let's slow this thing down. First of all, have a conversation. So I'm going to make this how we could have cleaned this up and made it a lot simpler. And she could have still gone on her dinner date had she asked the questions. And the question would be, you have to make a conversation out of it, because obviously the guy is going to want to understand some context to this. Because anytime you ask a question, and I like to do these things face to face. Some people want to do these things over the phone. I like doing these things face to face because it gives you an opportunity to read the person's body language. I mean, it could be awkward enough to be caught off guard when being questioned about something. But with something like this, which could have, like I said, the time frame could be really expanded, and you just happen to run into or in case she happened to have run into the people fairly recently, and it was just a conversation. Facts matter. Time frame in this particular case definitely matters, because as things started to unfold, we found out that these other conversations with people were over the course of, say, probably 9 to 10 months ago, almost a year ago. So it's not even recent. It's not really relevant. The second thing is, and this has to do with my friend who had initially declined the invitation, or accepted and then declined the invitation, she didn't really come to the conversation with just the memory of this conversation. Her old stuff was really playing a role in this. Her old stuff being her ex had been trying to make contact with her and get re-involved in her life. So now you have a little bit of spillover. And I'm explaining it that way because this is what happens in real life. I've learned many years ago, life is messy. You have things that happen, timelines collide, things spill over. Something happened earlier, it's on your mind, you're affected by that, you're having a conversation with the next person, and next thing you know, there might even be a blow up there. A little bit of misguided anger, a little bit of anxiety. Things are hot, tension is going, and you have an upset. This happens all the time, every day. So if this is a situation where you can imagine yourself being in this, how would you clean this up? Well, like I said, have a real specific conversation in mind with the person. Talk to them. The fact that there are so many people that would avoid having a direct conversation, they would just as soon just walk off. But what I think is important to understand here, this is a simple thing. It's one thing to be talking about a date. You're saying, well, why make such a big deal about somebody? There's lots of people out there. Yes, you're right. There are lots of people out there. You can go on to the next guy and maybe none of this stuff will happen and then there won't be any upsets or anything. Well, yeah, right. No, there's going to be an upset at some point in time. But the lessons learned, wherever you learn them, you can apply them to your daily life. And this is something I like to say really hits home. And I mean literally at home. If you have kids, if you have parents, you have relatives, siblings, whatever, you are going to have the same kinds of conflict. You're going to have people that don't say what needs to be said, people that are going to be passive aggressive. They're not going to share. They're things that happen. We're going to be putting all of these layers on to protect ourselves from being hurt. When what we really need to do is, number one, take ownership for how we feel. It doesn't mean we have to attack somebody else, especially when we're trying to have a conversation about what we think is going on. Take ownership for how you feel, making I statements. Ask reasonable questions and wait for the answer. I think it's really important that you get this process down because by doing this, you're going to bridge the communication gap. Because this really is about communication skills and styles. Pounding on the table and getting mad doesn't make the other person feel good. I mean, they certainly can get the idea that you're intense and that you're upset or something's gone on that you don't like. But what you want from the other person is real, authentic answers. You don't want something made up. You don't want a person to feel stressed and then try to tell you something that you want to hear. You want honest answers. So in this particular case, let me move it forward, is that the guy finally came around and started asking questions about why she declined the invitation. So guess what? The story came out about the other people. Guess what? He explained. That wasn't even recent. It just so happens that the guy is memorable, but there was no overlap. Remember how I explained that? See, there was no overlap. There was no breach of the integrity. It was all above board. And what was really most uncomfortable for her is when she acknowledged that her ex was sort of back in the picture. He's trying to make his way back into her life. So now she has the guy that she wanted to go out with, which she declined. That experience is butting up against the ex who was very toxic, who's trying to get back into her life, and she's feeling vulnerable. And that spillover, that was really what's happening in her orbit. And if you can imagine the confusion, the internal, the turmoil, the stuff that's going on inside, if this has happened to you, like I said, life is messy. These are the details. When you really strip this thing down to what's happening, you can see how we make choices based on what's going on in our experience and our perception and all of those drivers, and had this conversation come up with the new guy that had offered the invitation to go out to dinner, I think it would have been a much different outcome. And this would have been solved much, much earlier. I'm looking at my time. I need to take a break here, and I'm going to come back, and we'll talk about this some more.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And we're back. Again, this is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast, and I am John Johnson talking about the communication gap. As you can see from that scenario that I've set up, there are so many places where things can get lost because of what's going on in your head. And when you allow those things in your head to fill the spaces rather than you ask the questions and get answers, and I mean listen for the answers, take the time for that. That person that you're speaking to, I think you owe that to yourself as much as them. And for this experience, here's one that, after I had chatted with her and got some of the details, it was great that she and that other person finally had a chance to talk and really get this thing worked out. So now she was able to put what she had with the guy, the new guy, the one who asked her out to dinner, in a good place. There won't be this awkward, they want to avoid each other kind of thing because they've had a chance to talk it out. Now, I really have to give him credit for stepping up and asking the questions. Now, obviously, he was curious as to why there would be an acceptance and then a decline. I think anybody would. So expect that. And in the case of really opening this thing up, she shared that it's her ex-husband was trying to make his way back into her life, and she was really uncomfortable with that. She was experiencing the vulnerability and all of that stuff because obviously she had a history with that person, a relatively long history. So yeah, when people have been in your life and you've been with them for a long time and you're vulnerable to them and then they've gone and they show back up, yeah, there's some nostalgia there. There's a lot of stuff that's going on, and you have to work through some of that before you can get yourself strong enough so that when these people show up, and in this particular case, this person, the ex, it was a toxic situation, so she's obviously a little gun shy. It's probably not wanting to trust any men. Look, if you're a woman who is in that particular place, you got to work on that. I don't imagine that you want to be alone and are rejecting every person that comes through your experience. I know we kind of get into these places where we say, oh, wow, I'm terrible at picking somebody to be with. Well, maybe not. And I think in this particular case, the guy picked her because he thought she was a good person to go out with. And that's great. You're able to own that But if you have these other ghosts hanging around, then obviously there's going to be some spillover. And unfortunately, in this case, the spillover happened in the good guy paid a price for that. At least up until the point where he had the presence of mind to have a conversation with her about what was going on. And now they're great. I think she's probably not going to go out, at least not right away, because she revealed the fact that she has this old stuff that she definitely needs to address. But she doesn't have a conflict with the guy that originally asked her out. And that's the message. That's the takeaway here. And why? It's because they talked it out. They didn't leave it unspoken. A lot of people would have left that situation just like it was without being any clarification of what happened and a choice about what to do going forward. Now, this happens in families all the time. So this is an illustration of how off track things can get. And it's very unfortunate when things go astray. Everybody I know just wants to be loved. They want to be loved and accepted by someone. Now, we have to be vulnerable in order to gain that. And it's in that vulnerability that can be really, really hard, because if you feel like you've been taken or advantage of, or you've loved and lost, and that hurt thing happens, well, yeah, it's hard to get back into that and want to be vulnerable again. But do it for your sake. And when it comes to the conflict resolution, like I said, that takes practice. Reading books doesn't necessarily make you good at this. It means you may be well read, but you really have to get engaged with this, because you could read a book and imagine you having a conversation with someone you're familiar with, but pick a situation and you're not so familiar with it, you're going to struggle with it. So it takes practice. And with practice, you're going to learn where you are the person who's holding all the cards, and then there are going to be the times when you're the person who is not in the position of power. So kindness is important. You'll notice tone, their voice, how you talk to people is important. You can say if you're going to be menacing, people aren't generally going to be very forthright, because that's just more of the same. It's about fear and intimidation. And that's not what we want. We want openness and honesty and appreciation for that. And when you're having a conversation with somebody about this, like I say, ask the question and be patient and let them answer. And ask more questions. And by the time this conversation is over with, I think you will have at least hit the high points. The stuff that was big, that was hanging out there, the big questions. And you may wind up really getting to the root of what the misunderstanding is about. And in this particular case, the woman had ghosts from her past. And hearing about this guy having asked other people out, like I said, he was single. He wasn't cheating on anyone. And the fact was, none of the stuff was overlapped. And even if it had been, so what? People can go out with whoever they want to go out with. And if he had lied about it, that's one thing. But as I stated before, there was never a lie. So it may seem like I'm on the guy's side of this. And in a sense, maybe so. I'm a guy who can see how these things get out around. But to the women who have experienced maybe something similar to this, or it's a possibility that you would, because I have a lot of women that listen to this podcast. And I don't want you to go away thinking that all guys are dogs, because all of them aren't. There are a lot of good guys out there. It may take a little bit of work to find them. And here's an example of a guy who just happens to seem like he's pretty jovial and lighthearted and gets around, says hi to everybody, and seems like he's a pretty good guy. And that's just not from me saying it. That's from my friend. She said it. But she just heard something that made her a little bit uncomfortable. So I encouraged her to, take a step back, think about it some more. And I'm sure if, in time, the opportunity will present itself again, maybe with the same guy, maybe not. but in the interest of fairness and for her benefit, to learn to speak what's on her mind rather than keep it hidden. Because think of how many things